Hey everyone, today we are going to be getting into my part 2 of the Canon EOS R versus R6, and my previous video focused more on the photography aspects of each camera. In this video we're going to be focusing more on the video features for the camera. So if you've been trying to decide whether to get one of these cameras for your own workflow, I think this might be the video for you. Alright, so before we get into everything, I want to show you guys a video montage that I made of video footage from both the EOS R and R6, and I'd be curious to see if you could even pick out the difference between the two cameras. Maybe if you have like a 4K monitor, you might be able to, but let me know in the comments section below if you could even tell the difference between the EOS R and EOS R6 footage in this clip that I'm about to show you. Okay, so something that I touched on in the last video that I quickly want to touch on in this video is the time-lapse video features. If you haven't checked out my previous video on that, I'll link it above and you can check out the time-lapse features on the R6. But it is worth mentioning that both cameras do a great job at taking an internal 4K movie time-lapse if you need that feature. So before I get into everything with the comparisons for each video camera, I just wanted to share my own experience with both of the cameras for video. And honestly, my experience with the EOS R and the EOS R6 have been really positive. So I've been able to use both of these cameras for professional work, and while it is nice not having to worry about potential overheating with the Canon EOS R, I've never actually had the R6 overheat, and like I mentioned in my previous video, I've used that camera for video shoots that went over 2 hours and where the camera was on for the majority of the time. Now, that being said, I was using the camera with an external monitor, the Ninja 5, that is going to extend my record time a little bit, but even then, I think if you're careful with the R6 and you turn it off when you're not using it, you can definitely get away with using that camera for professional work. Just make sure you have a backup, and that's why I bring my EOS R everywhere I go to. So if I were looking for a video camera and I were deciding between the EOS R and the EOS R6, I think that I would probably still go with the EOS R6 just because the features like the in-body image stabilization and the better low-light autofocus acquisition, those are really important to me. So, alright, so for our first comparison right here, we have the Canon EOS R on the left and the R6 on the right, and both of these were shot at ISO 400 1/50th of a second at 24 frames per second and in C-Log. So we'll zoom in here and see what the difference is. So you can definitely tell that the image quality on the Canon EOS R6 is way better than the EOS R, especially when you zoom in like this. When you're kind of at the standard framing for 4K and you're not cropping in, it's a little bit harder to tell, but when you zoom in, you can definitely tell that there's more detail in the R6, and it's also less noise too. So interesting, because they're both shot at the same settings, but the Canon EOS R is gonna naturally just kind of tend to have more noise, especially in the shadows. And you will notice that there is a color difference, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but the R6 is rendering a little bit warmer than the EOS R. So this is what the EOS R actually looks like at 35 millimeters, which is what I had my EOS R6 set to. So you can get an idea of the crop difference that you're going to get when you're shooting in 4K in both of the cameras. Alright, so now let's check out the autofocus on the Canon EOS R. I have the light turned up to about 60% right now, and the autofocus is fine when I'm going back and forth between this kettlebell and the rack. Now if I zoom in and I try to go between the kettlebell and the outlet in the back, again, everything is really confident, so there's definitely enough light right now for the Canon EOS R. Now let me turn it down to 20% and see how the autofocus system does with that. Again, it's pretty confident, yeah. It's not really struggling at all. And turning it down to 10%, this is when we start to see some issues with the autofocus, and it's just not as confident as it was. You can see it's having a hard time acquiring focus on the kettlebell especially. Similar to the R, the R6 does fine with the light at 60%. When we go down to 20%, it still holds up. And you'll see when we go down to 10%, the autofocus system is still confident at 10%. So this really does a great job when compared to the EOS R, and I think I even turn it down to 4% and it still does a decent job. So now we're testing out the image stabilization. This is on the Canon EOS R, and right now basically the only image stabilization that we're getting is from the lens, which is the RF 15 to 35. The Canon EOS R does not have in-body image stabilization. It does have digital, but there's no mechanical in-body image stabilization. Same thing on the Canon EOS R6. We are getting stabilization from the 15 to 35 RF lens in conjunction with the in-body image stabilization that's on the R6. So I believe that we're getting up to 7 stops of image stabilization here. So this is what it looks like handheld. In both of these cameras you can use digital image stabilization, but I tend to stay away from it because you start to get a image quality breakdown when you use it. Here's the basic, and here's the enhanced image stabilization. I like them for handheld shots, but you can't do any panning or anything like that just because you start to get this like jittery choppiness to it. So here's the rolling shutter on the EOS R. And here is the R6. As you can see, they're both pretty bad, so I believe the R5 does better in this regard. The R6 is better for slow motion just because you can shoot in 1080 and you can shoot in C-Log too for 120 frames per second. With the R, you're pretty limited and it's only 720p. Before I move on, if you guys like this content, please help me out by liking this video and leaving a comment below. I'd love to see what you guys are thinking about getting if you don't have these cameras, and if you do have the cameras, I'd love to see, I'd love to hear your experience with each of the cameras. So, alright, so based off of those comparisons, most people could probably say that the R6 is going to be better for video if you are not absolutely terrified of the camera overheating. Obviously, if you're working on higher end projects, you're probably not going to be using a mirrorless camera to take video, but I think that this decision is for people that are looking for more of like a B camera, or they're just getting into video production like I am, and they need something to start out with. Even though the EOS R and the EOS R6 aren't cinema cameras, they're still very capable for professional work, and it really just depends on what you're doing. If I didn't have either camera, I would probably still go with the R6 just because I really appreciate the extra added features like the in-body image stabilization, which is really helpful when you don't have access to a tripod. I love the fact that it's way more confident with its autofocus in lower light environments, and also I think it's great that it does have a built-in interval timer, so I can take a series of time-lapse photos to put together in post. And the added image quality of the 4K is just kind of like the icing on the cake. Not to mention that you can shoot 120 frames per second in the R6 at 1080p, which is, while it's not like the highest quality 120 frames per second, it is definitely a step up from the 720p 120 frames per second that you're getting in the Canon EOS R. Now, all of that being said, one thing I kind of do like about the EOS R is that there is a crop factor. I found that with the lens lineup that I have, with the 15 to 35, the 50 millimeter and the 85 millimeter, I was able to work around that crop, the 1.7, I think it's a 1.76 times crop on the Canon EOS R without too much difficulty. And for certain situations, like if I was trying to get wildlife shots, having that 4K crop in there was, actually pretty awesome, just because I could get that extra reach and also have these really detailed 4K files to work with. One thing that I didn't really get into in terms of comparisons for this video was high ISO noise performance, but you can find a ton of that on YouTube already. And basically you're gonna be doing a lot better with the R6 than on the R. Even you can see in the image quality comparisons that I put up earlier in this video, even at the base ISO of 400, you're still getting more noise on the Canon EOS R file than the R6. So for me, the biggest drawback to the Canon EOS R6 for video is that it seems to read the white balance a lot warmer than the Canon EOS R. Usually if I'm setting custom white balance from scene to scene in a video, it's not much of an issue. I seem to get a really good color, but if I'm just setting the white balance to like a daylight setting, you can definitely tell that the skin tones are a lot more yellow than on the R. And it's kind of a pain if you're trying to match the two cameras. And one more thing that I find to be a drawback for both of these cameras is that there's no way to create a backup file to the second card slot. I mean, the EOS R doesn't even have a second card slot, but the R6 won't allow you to create a backup copy to that second card. So, you know, that is something that you're still going to have to, I believe the R5 will do it, but if you're with Canon, you're still going to have to look at those cinema cameras for that feature. Now for me, I do use the Atomos Ninja V for recording, so you can't create a backup with that anyways. But I do still, even though I have the R6 that can record 10-bit C-Log internally, I do still find myself using the external monitor just because I like the larger screen. So I have 500 gigabyte solid state drives that I can record to, and it's really easy to kind of just pop into the computer, and the transfer speeds are really fast. It is worth mentioning that with the Canon EOS R, you can only do C-Log 8-bit internal with that. I usually do attach the external monitor to my Canon EOS R in order to get 10-bit C-Log, but you can record 10-bit C-Log with the Canon EOS R6, which is awesome. Now that being said, you don't have access to an all-I file, but I work around that with the external monitor anyways, and I just record in ProRes. But if you are recording internally, you have to work with these IPB files that are hard to work with in post. And on top of that, it's utilizing a new codec, which is the H.265 codec. And that's harder for a lot of old computers to work with as well. I found that Final Cut Pro seems to have an easier time with those files, but if I upload them to Adobe Premiere, it really struggles. So I usually have to transcode that footage. Okay guys, so I gave you my thoughts on these two cameras. I think that they're both very capable, and obviously if you're just beginning, the Canon EOS R is going to be a great value for video, especially if you don't have a lot of RF glass and you're working with more of the EF glass. You might be better off with the Canon EOS R, just because you aren't going to get those extra features with the in-body image stabilization. But obviously if you have the extra money, I think that the Canon EOS R6 is a great video camera. I know a lot of people are worried about the overheating, but just giving you my perspective, it hasn't been an issue for me. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys later.